Part 2. Preparing to study law. 5. Arguing effectively. 1. Logical arguments. Hi, Alex. As I've said before, probably the most important and valuable thing you'll have to do as a law student is learn how to argue effectively. Given that you've now decided you want to study law at university, I thought you might appreciate a few pointers on how to make good, effective arguments of your own, and in so doing show you how to make up your mind whether an argument that is being made to you is any good or not. This won't just come in useful for your legal studies. It's also essential that you be able to argue effectively if you are applying to a university that interviews applicants before deciding whether to offer them a place. There are two basic kinds of argument that you'll come across in doing your law degree and in life generally. We can call them logical arguments, otherwise known as arguments by deduction, and speculative arguments, otherwise known as arguments by induction. I'll talk about speculative arguments in another letter, but in this letter I'll just concentrate on logical arguments. These take the following kind of form. 1. All children like chocolate. 2. Max is a child. Therefore. 3. Max likes chocolate. Steps 1 and 2 in the argument are called the premises of the argument. Step 3 is called the conclusion. If 1 and 2 are correct, and 3 logically follows from 1 and 2, then we have to accept that 3 is correct. If we don't, we're just plain stupid or crazy. An example of a logical argument that a lawyer might make goes as follows. 1. The law says that A's promise to B is legally binding if B gives us something in return for that promise. 2. Helen promised to mow Peter's lawn if Peter bought her a drink, and he did so. Therefore. 3. Helen is legally required to mow Peter's lawn. I'll now make 5 points about logical arguments that you should always bear in mind, either in making a logical argument of your own, or in making up your mind whether a logical argument that someone else has made to you is any good or not. 5 points about logical arguments. 1. Circularity. The very first point about making a logical argument is that you have to ensure that it is not circular. A circular argument assumes in one or more of its premises the truth of its conclusion. A circular argument fails because it doesn't go anywhere. It just asserts that the conclusion is true without having done anything to establish that it is true. So a circular argument never even gets off the launch pad. Here's an argument against capital punishment that is very obviously circular. 1. The state should not execute criminals. Therefore. 2. We should not have capital punishment. 1 and 2 are basically identical statements, dressed up in different words. So, 1 does not establish that 2 is true, it just assumes that 2 is true. Here's a more subtle form of circular argument. 1. Killing is always wrong. Therefore. 2. We should not have capital punishment. 1 and 2 are not identical, but the argument is still circular because 1 assumes that 2 is true. If capital punishment were morally justified, then killing would not always be wrong. So by saying killing is always wrong, the person making the above argument is already assuming that we should not have capital punishment. So he is really just asserting, rather than arguing, that we should not have capital punishment. This second form of circularity sometimes creeps into lawyers' arguments. Consider, for example, the case where someone pays Norman £1,000 to beat up Emily. It is uncontroversial that after Norman beats up Emily, he will be held liable to compensate Emily for her injuries. But can Emily sue Norman for the gain he has made from beating her up the £1,000? Those in favor of what is called restitution for wrongs often argue that Emily should be able to sue Norman for this gain by saying, 1. No man should be allowed to profit from his wrong. Therefore. 2. Emily should be allowed to sue Norman for the gain that he has made by beating her up. But this is circular. 1 assumes the truth of 2. If it would be wrong to allow Emily to sue Norman for the gain he has made, then it is not true that no man should be allowed to profit from his wrong. Norman should be allowed to profit from his wrong. So by saying 1, The person making the above argument is simply assuming that 2 is true rather than making a serious argument in favor of 2 being true. You'll notice that the above 3 circular arguments all just have one premise and then leap straight to a conclusion. This is a sure sign that something has gone wrong. A logical argument that works has at least 2 premises which work together to reach a conclusion. If a logical argument that you are making or looking at has only one premise, then there is something wrong with it, and the problem will almost always be that the argument is circular. 2. You can't derive an ought from an is. Consider this argument in favor of capital punishment. 1. Reintroducing the death penalty for murder would reduce the number of murders in this country. Therefore, 2. We should reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Again, this argument only has one premise before leaping straight to a conclusion, so there is something wrong with it. But this time the problem is not circularity. Premise 1 does not assume the truth of conclusion 2. The problem is that the person making this argument is trying to derive an ought. We should reintroduce the death penalty for murder from an is. Reintroducing the death penalty for murder would reduce the number of killings in this country. This is impossible. You cannot make a value judgment about what should or should not happen based purely on a bare statement of fact about what is or is not, or would be or would not be, or was not the case. What has gone wrong with the above argument is that it is too compressed. We need to introduce a value statement into the premises of the argument to make it work. 1. Reintroducing the death penalty for murder would reduce the murder rate in this country. 2. We should do everything possible to reduce the murder rate. Therefore, 3. We should reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Because there is now a should in the premises of the argument, it is now legitimate to have a should in the argument's conclusion. This basic principle that you cannot derive an ought from an is not always observed as well as it should be by lawyers. For example, let's go back to the case of Norman and Emily. Should Emily be allowed to sue Norman for what are called exemplary damages designed to punish Norman for what he did to Emily? Those who say no often argue. 1. The function of an award of damages to the victim of a wrong is to compensate the victim for the losses she has suffered as a result of that wrong. 2. Exemplary damages are punitive rather than compensatory in nature. Therefore, 3. Emily should not be allowed to sue Norman for exemplary damages. Here, we are deriving an ought. Emily should not be allowed to sue from 2. Is the function of an award of damages is. Exemplary damages are not allowed. The above argument is a particularly bad one because it is impossible to save it. If we reformulate it to introduce a should statement into the premises as follows. 1. The function of an award of damages to the victim of a wrong should be to compensate the victim for the losses she has suffered as a result of that wrong. 2. Exemplary damages are punitive rather than compensatory in nature. Therefore, 3. Emily should not be allowed to sue Norman for exemplary damages. Can you see what problem the argument now suffers from? Yes, it's now circular. The argument's first premise assumes that the argument's conclusion is true. If Emily should be allowed to sue for exemplary damages, then it can't be true that the function of an award of damages to someone like Emily should just be to compensate her for the losses that she has suffered. So by saying 1, the person making this argument is assuming that 3 is true rather than arguing that is true. 2. In a logical argument, the conclusion must follow logically from its premises. Consider the following argument for capital punishment. 1. We should reintroduce the death penalty for murder, if doing so would reduce the number of murders in this country. 2. Studies have shown that reintroducing the death penalty would have no effect on the murder rate in this country. Therefore, 3. We should reintroduce the death penalty for murder. It is pretty obvious what is wrong with this argument. Its premises do not support its conclusion. If you are being logical, you simply cannot conclude on the basis of premises 1 and 2. That we should reintroduce the death penalty for murder. You should instead conclude that there is no case so far as you know for reintroducing the death penalty for murder. So when you are making a logical argument, make sure that your conclusion follows logically from its premises. If you don't do this, your argument isn't logical at all, it's illogical, and doesn't give anyone any reason to accept your conclusion. One form of illogical argument that you have to be particularly on your guard against making is one which suffers from the post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this fallacy, that is, the fallacy of thinking that because B happened after A, that B happened because of A. This argument, which, I repeat, you should be on your guard against making, takes the form: 1. A happened. 2. After A happened, B happened. Therefore, 3. B happened because A happened. Even though B happened after A happened, it does not follow logically that B happened, because A happened B could have happened for any number of reasons other than A's happening. A concrete example of an argument that suffers from the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy goes as follows. 1. The death penalty for murder was abolished in 1965. 2. After 1965, the murder rate rocketed, with more than double the murders per 100,000 of the population being committed in 2004 as compared with the rate in 1965. Therefore, 3. The murder rate more than doubled between 1965 and 2004 because the death penalty for murder was abolished in 1965. Well, maybe 3 is true, but it certainly does not follow logically from 1 and 2. There could be an alternative explanation of why 2 happened. Maybe the social trends that resulted in the death penalty being abolished in 1965 also resulted in the murder rate doubling between 1965 and 2004. Another very common type of illogical argument is an argument that suffers from tunnel vision. A very good example of this kind of argument is provided by Henry Hazlitt's excellent book, Economics in One Lesson, which I recommend to anyone who wants an education in how to argue effectively. The book begins with a story. A baker's window has been broken by a teenager who has hurled a brick through it. A crowd gathers and concludes that actually the breaking of the window is a good thing. The baker will now have to pay a glazier to install a new window, thus keeping the glazier in business. And the glazier will in turn spend the money he has earned from the baker, thus keeping a variety of people in business. And they in turn will spend the money they have earned from the glazier, thus keeping yet more people in business, etc., etc. So, the argument goes: 1. It is good for people to be employed. 2. The economic activity sparked by the breaking of the window will keep a number of different people in business. Therefore, 3. It was a good thing the window was broken. This argument is illogical because it suffers from tunnel vision. What it leaves out of the picture is what the baker would have done with the money that he is now going to pay the glazier to replace his window. In Hazlitt's example, the baker would have used that money to pay the tailor to make a suit for him. Using the money to pay the tailor to make a suit would have sparked an equal amount of economic activity as that which will be sparked by paying the glazier to mend the window, thus keeping as many people in business as will be kept in business when the glazier is paid to mend the window. So had the window not been broken, the community as a whole would have had an intact window plus a new suit plus a certain amount of economic activity sparked by the buying of the new suit. But as it is now that the window has been broken, the community as a whole will still have an intact window once it has been mended by the glazier plus a certain amount of economic activity sparked by the bakers paying to have the window mended, but it will have no new suit. It follows that the breaking of the window has made the community worse off as a whole, so 3 is not true. It was not a good thing the window was broken. The crowd cannot see that because it suffers from tunnel vision. All it can see is the broken window and the economic activity that will be sparked by its replacement. It does not have the vision or imagination to see the new suit that would have been made had the window never been broken, and the economic activity that would have been sparked by that new suits being made. Here is an argument against capital punishment that is illogical because it suffers from tunnel vision. It is a bad thing for innocent people to die. 2. If we reintroduce the death penalty for murder, there is a danger that innocent people will be convicted of murder and be executed as a result. Therefore, 3. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. This is illogical. Even though 1 and 2 are perfectly true, 3 does not follow from 1 and 2. The problem is that the person making this argument is simply focusing on the innocent people who might be killed by the state if the death penalty is reintroduced. What he is overlooking is that reintroducing the death penalty for murder might cut the murder rate, and as a result save a lot of innocent people's lives. In order to restore some logic to the above argument against capital punishment, we need to get rid of the blinkers and take into account the possibility that innocent people's lives might be saved by reintroducing the death penalty for murder. There are 2 ways of doing this. We could argue, 1. It is a bad thing for innocent people to die. 2. If we reintroduce the death penalty for murder, there is a danger that innocent people will be convicted of murder and be executed as a result. 3. There is also a possibility that reintroducing the death penalty for murder will reduce the murder rate and save innocent people's lives. 4. The number of people who are likely to be wrongfully executed if we reintroduce the death penalty for murder exceeds the number of people who are likely to escape being murdered if we reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Therefore, 5. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Or we could argue more boldly. 1. It is better that an unlimited number of innocent people be murdered than that one innocent person be executed by the state. 2. If we reintroduce the death penalty for murder, there is a danger that an innocent person will be convicted of murder and executed by the state. Therefore, 3. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. And this is so no matter how many innocent people's lives might be saved by doing so. 4. A logical argument that is based on a false premise is worthless. Both of the arguments that have just been made against reintroducing capital punishment are perfectly logical. But the fact that an argument is logical does not mean we should accept it. If a logical argument is based on a false premise, it must be rejected. A logical argument that is based on a false premise doesn't give us any reason to accept its conclusion. In contrast, if the premises of a logical argument are correct, and of course the argument's conclusion logically follows from those premises, then that argument must be accepted. We would be crazy or stupid not to accept it. Consider, for example, the logical argument set out at the beginning of this letter. 1. All children like chocolate. 2. Max is a child. Therefore, 3. Max likes chocolate. If 1 and 2 are true, then we have to accept that 3 is true, because 3 follows logically from 1 and 2, otherwise we're just stupid or crazy. But if either 1 or 2 is not true, then this argument gives us no reason at all to think that Max likes chocolate. If it's the case that not all children like chocolate, or it's the case that Max is 45 years old, then the argument completely collapses and should be rejected. Of course, it may still be the case that 3 is true. Max may actually like chocolate. But the point is that if either 1 or 2 is not true, the above argument gives us no reason to think that Max likes chocolate. Let's look again at one of the arguments made above against capital punishment. 1. It is a bad thing for innocent people to die. 2. If we reintroduce the death penalty for murder, there is a danger that innocent people will be convicted of murder and be executed as a result. 3. There is also a possibility that reintroducing the death penalty for murder will reduce the murder rate and save innocent people's lives. 4. The number of people who are likely to be wrongfully executed if we reintroduce the death penalty for murder exceeds the number of people who are likely to escape being murdered if we reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Therefore, 5. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. This argument is perfectly logical, so whether we accept its conclusion depends on whether its premises are correct. Premises 1-3 seem perfectly reasonable. So whether we should accept this argument or not all depends on whether premise 4 is correct. Unfortunately, premise 4 does not seem to be correct. In the UK, 636 people were murdered in 2010-11. It's not hard to imagine that, say, 30 of those 636 people would not have been killed if we still had the death penalty for murder. But it is hard to imagine that if we still had the death penalty for murder in 2010-11, there would have been more than 30 wrongful convictions for murder resulting in the convicted being executed. So the above argument against capital punishment should be rejected. It rests on a false premise, and therefore doesn't give us any reason to think that we should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Two common sources of false premises that you should always be on the lookout for when making your own logical arguments or examining other people's are wishful thinking and, again, tunnel vision. Consider the following argument that is often made for saying that animals do not have rights. 1. You can only have rights if you have responsibilities at the same time. 2. Animals do not have any responsibilities, for example, a responsibility not to kick their owner. Therefore, 3. Animals do not have rights. 1 is obviously incorrect. If 1 were correct, then babies or patients in a coma would not have rights either, and obviously they do. So why do people keep on saying 1? Either they say it because they do not wish to admit that animals have rights, and so they wish 1 were true, the idea being that if 1 were true, then that would make it easy for them to deny that animals have rights. Or they say 1 because they suffer from tunnel vision. They don't have the vision or imagination to realize that 1 cannot be true, because if it were, then babies or patients in a coma would not have rights either. Here's another example of tunnel vision producing a false premise. This time the argument is meant to establish that it is okay sometimes to lie to someone else. The argument begins by supposing that we are in Nazi Germany. A woman runs into your house and says, "I'm a Jew on the run. Some Nazi soldiers are a couple of minutes behind me. If they catch me, they will kill me. Please hide me." You usher the woman into your cellar. The soldiers bang on your door 2 minutes later and ask you, "We are looking for an escaped prisoner who would have come by here. Do you know where she is?" The argument goes as follows. 1. Either you can tell the soldiers the truth that the woman is hiding in your cellar, with the result that they will kill her, or you can save the woman's life by lying to the soldiers, telling them that you saw someone running away down the road a couple of minutes earlier. 2. It would be unacceptable to take the first option, given the consequences of doing so. Therefore, 3. You should lie to the soldiers. But 1 is not true. Anyone not suffering from tunnel vision would realize that there are other options available to you in this situation. You could refuse to answer, or you could give an answer which is literally true. Yes, a woman did come by here 2 minutes ago looking for help. She can't be that far away now. Or you could remonstrate with the soldiers, thereby changing the subject and possibly doing some positive good at the same time. Yes, I saw a woman come by here a couple of minutes ago. You should be ashamed of yourselves, hunting down a poor girl like that. What would your mothers think if they knew? So this particular argument in favor of establishing that it is acceptable under certain circumstances to lie to someone else simply does not work. 5. Logical arguments that culminate in an ought are often inconclusive. Consider another one of the arguments against capital punishment that was made above. 1. It is better that an unlimited number of innocent people be murdered than that one innocent person be executed by the state. 2. If we reintroduce the death penalty for murder, there is a danger that an innocent person will be convicted of murder and executed by the state. Therefore, 3. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. And this is so no matter how many innocent people's lives might be saved by doing so. Again, this argument is perfectly logical, so whether we accept its conclusion or not depends on whether its premises are correct. 2 is obviously true, so the crucial premise is 1. If 1 is true, then we should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. So is 1 true? Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell for certain. One school of thought holds that it is better to allow other people's rights to be violated than it is to violate someone else's rights oneself. On this view, one is true. Even if thousands of lives could be saved by reintroducing the death penalty for murder, it would still be wrong to reintroduce it if doing so would result in the state violating someone's rights sometime in the future. On the same view, it would be wrong to torture an innocent person to discover where terrorists are planning to explode a nuclear bomb, even though doing so would prevent millions of people being murdered. However, there is another school of thought that says we should judge what to do by weighing up the costs and benefits of the consequences of our actions. On this view, one is obviously not true. If reintroducing the death penalty for murder would do more good than harm, then it is obviously better to reintroduce the death penalty. Unfortunately, there is no rational way to determine which view is correct. No logical argument can be made that would show us that the deontological view is correct and the consequentialist view wrong, or that the opposite is true. So we have no way of determining for certain whether one is true. It follows that this particular argument against capital punishment must be labeled inconclusive. It might be wrong or it might be right. We just don't know for certain. This will often be the case with logical arguments that culminate in an ought statement here. We should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder. Because you can't derive an ought from an is. Logical arguments that conclude by saying that we should or should not do something will always have, as part of their premises, some kind of value judgment or should statement. And as we just saw, it's often very difficult to tell for certain whether that value judgment or should statement is correct. So logical arguments that conclude by saying that we should or should not do something will often be inconclusive. We just won't know for certain whether we should accept them or not. But you shouldn't conclude from this that making logical arguments that culminate in an ought statement is a waste of time. First, there are some value judgments or should statements that we know for certain are correct and can provide the basis for making conclusive logical arguments in favor of a particular ought statement. It is wrong to stub out cigarettes on little babies. It is wrong to kill people for kicks or because of their political views. It is good to feed someone who is starving. We should be kind as often as possible. We know these things for certain and can sometimes use this knowledge to build conclusive arguments about what we should and should not do. Secondly, making an inconclusive logical argument in favor of a particular ought statement can be useful because doing so can help people make up their mind whether or not they accept that that ought statement is true, and that in turn can influence their decisions about what to do or who to vote for in an election. So, for example, suppose you establish that the only logical argument that can be made against the reintroduction of the death penalty for murder is one which rests on the premise: it is better that an unlimited number of innocent people be murdered than that one innocent person be executed by the state. If this is the case, then most people will probably conclude, rightly or wrongly, we really can't tell, that there is no good reason why we should not reintroduce the death penalty for murder, and give their support to a political party that campaigns for the reinstatement of capital punishment. Types of logical argument. I've now said enough to allow you to ensure that any logical arguments you make in future will stand up to scrutiny, and to help you detect any flaws in a logical argument that is being made to you. But before I sign off, I'll just point out 4 very common types of logical argument that you may want to use in the future when trying to establish a particular point. 1. Kill all the alternatives arguments. This sort of argument goes as follows. 1. Either A or B or C is true. 2. Neither A nor B is true. Therefore, 3. C must be true. This sort of argument underlays Sherlock Holmes' principle as expressed in Arthur Conan Doyle's novel The Sign of 4, that once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The professor in C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe used a kill all the alternatives argument to establish that Lucy was telling the truth when she said that she had entered a magical world through the back of a wardrobe in the professor's house. 1. Either Lucy is telling the truth, or she is lying, or she is mad. 2. We know that Lucy isn't a liar, and that she is not mad. Therefore, 3. Lucy must be telling the truth. When you are examining whether a kill all the alternatives argument stands up, be particularly on the lookout to see whether the first premise, which will be along the lines of either A or B or C is true, suffers from tunnel vision. Is there some other possibility that may also be true in this situation, so as to make it possible that A and B and C may all be untrue? Is it possible that Lucy is not lying, and that she is not mad, but that she is not telling the truth either? Maybe the fur coats stored in the wardrobe give off fumes that overcame Lucy and caused her to go into a trance where she dreamed that she was in a magical world. The fact that this is perfectly possible destroys the professor's argument. It has to be adjusted so that it goes as follows. 1. Either Lucy is telling the truth, or she is lying, or she is mad, or something happened to Lucy in the wardrobe to make her think incorrectly that she was in a magical world. 2. We know that Lucy isn't a liar, and that she is not mad. Therefore, 3. Either Lucy is telling the truth, or something happened to Lucy in the wardrobe to make her think incorrectly that she was in a magical world. The professor's argument no longer goes all the way to establish that Lucy must be telling the truth. For it to go that far, the only remaining alternative that something happened to Lucy in the wardrobe to make her think incorrectly that she was in a magical world has to be killed off. 2. Arguments from contradiction. The professor could have killed off this remaining alternative through another common kind of logical argument, which is an argument from contradiction. This argument goes as follows. 1. For it to be true, B would also have to be true. 2. But we know B is not true. Therefore, 3. A is not true. So had anyone countered the professor's first argument for thinking Lucy must have been telling the truth with the objection. But it's possible that when she went into the wardrobe, she was overcome by fumes which caused her to hallucinate and think she was in a magical land. The professor could have argued back. 1. For that to be true, it would also have to be the case that she stayed long enough in the wardrobe to hallucinate all the experiences she said she had after she entered into the wardrobe. 2. But we know she did not stay long enough in the wardrobe. For that to happen, she came out of the wardrobe a few seconds after she entered into it. Therefore, 3. We cannot put what happened to Lucy down to a chemically induced trance. When someone makes an argument from contradiction to you, again be particularly on the lookout to check that the first premise, for it to be true, B would also have to be true, is correct. Is it really the case that B has also to be true for it to be true? 3. Cost-benefit arguments. An extremely common form of logical argument is a cost-benefit argument. An example is 1. We should do X if the benefits of doing X outweigh the costs. 2. The benefits of doing X outweigh the costs. Therefore, 3. We should do X. In examining this argument, test whether its premises are correct. If doing X would violate someone's rights, then it would still be wrong to do X, even if the benefits of doing X outweighed the costs. It cannot be right to sacrifice people for the greater good. So if doing X would violate someone's rights, then 1 will not be correct. In examining whether 2 is correct, watch out for 2 things. First of all, watch out for sentimentalism. An example of sentimentalism is when someone argues in favor of some security measure, such as ID cards, by saying, if it just saves one life, it's worth it. No, it's not. If life were that infinitely precious, then we would ban cars. Doing so would save thousands of lives each year. And this saving of life would more than offset the colossal sacrifice in wealth and happiness that banning cars would involve. The second thing you need to look out for is the problem of incommensurability. 2 things are incommensurable if there is no common standard of measurement that we can use to compare the two. For example, suppose that it is proposed that we should raise taxes to fund a nationwide program of home care for the mentally ill. The cost of doing this would be to retard economic growth by 0.5% a year. The benefit of doing this would be that the healthcare system in this country would treat the mentally ill with a greater level of respect and dignity than is currently possible. These two things cannot be weighed against each other. They are so completely different that there is no common standard of measurement that would allow us to say that the costs of raising taxes to fund this healthcare program outweigh the benefits or vice versa. So it's not possible to resolve the question of whether taxes should be raised to fund this program through a cost-benefit argument. We simply have to choose which of these things economic growth, and treating the mentally ill with dignity, and showing them some respect we value more. 4. Arguments from analogy. Finally, a big favorite with lawyers are arguments from analogy. These kinds of arguments go as follows. 1. In situation A, B is true. 2. Situation C is identical to situation A in all material respects. Therefore, 3. In situation C, B is true. So, for example, one of the most basic arguments that lawyers learn to make is the following argument from analogy. 1. In case A, a previous court awarded damages to the claimant. 2. The case here is identical to case A in all material respects. 3. Like cases should be decided alike. Therefore, 4. In this situation, the court should award damages to the claimant, in this case, my client. In making up your mind whether an argument from analogy is correct or not, the thing to look at is whether the second premise, this situation is identical to the first situation in all material respects, is true. Is it really true that there is no material difference between the situation at hand and the situation we initially considered? For example, here is a very famous argument in favor of the view that pregnant women have a right to have an abortion, based on the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson's article, A Defense of Abortion, published in 1971, in the first volume of the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. Consider the situation where Samantha has got extremely drunk one night and has ended up in hospital. The doctors treating Samantha realize that she has the same blood type as Frederick, a world-famous violinist who is in the same hospital because he is in dire need of a kidney transplant. The doctors realize they have a way of saving Frederick's life. They insert a tube into the main artery leading away from Frederick's heart, and insert the other end of the tube into the renal artery leading into one of Samantha's kidneys. They then insert a tube into the renal vein leading away from the same kidney, and pump the blood coming through that tube into Frederick's body. As a result, Frederick's blood is cleaned by Samantha's kidney, thus removing the need for him to have an immediate kidney transplant. When Samantha wakes up, she asks why she is hooked up to the patient in the next bed in this way, and her doctors tell her, "We've done this so he can survive until we get him a new kidney." When Samantha protests, the doctors say, "Look, if we disconnect you, he'll die, and he doesn't deserve that. Everyone has a right to live. Anyway, you can't complain. If you hadn't got so drunk last night, you wouldn't be in this position." When Samantha asks how long she has to wait for Frederick to have a kidney transplant, the doctors say, "Given his position on the waiting list, we think you'll have to stay like this for 9 months." Now let's assume that in this situation, Samantha has a right to tell the doctors to get lost and disconnect her from Frederick, whatever the consequences for Frederick. If we accept that, then what about the case where Mandy gets extremely drunk one night, has unprotected sex, and discovers a few days later that she is pregnant? Does she have a right to have an abortion? The argument from analogy in favor of saying that she does goes as follows. 1. Samantha has a right to be disconnected from Frederick, even though Frederick will die as a result. 2. Mandy's case is identical to Samantha's in all material respects. After one drunken night, Mandy has discovered that someone else's life, the life of the fetus inside her, is dependent on her not disconnecting herself from that someone else, the fetus inside her, and that if she does not disconnect herself from that someone else, she will have to remain connected to that someone else for 9 months. Therefore, 3. Mandy has a right to disconnect herself from the fetus inside her. That is, Mandy has a right to have an abortion. Does this argument work? The crucial step in the argument is premise 2. Is Mandy's case really identical to Samantha's in all material respects? I'll leave you to think about that and tell you what I think in my next letter. Be in touch soon. Nick.